Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the session on managing climate change in India. Before I get to the subject and the speakers, I'd like to start with remembrance. This session became possible when it's very difficult to even use the word, the late Vikram Kirloskar. So Vikram rang me up about a few months ago and said that he supports CSEP, which is the Center for Social and Economic Progress, and we'd like one of our distinguished fellows to speak at BIC. I said, consider it done. And that was really the genesis of the program that we are doing today. It's, absolutely unfortunate that we lost him last month. Managing climate change in India, in economics and public policy, they say there are wicked problems. I would say climate change would be a very, very wicked problem to solve. And it's very complex, very interdependent, and I think the world is struggling in terms of how to wrap their arms around this whole issue and fix it. Our main speaker is Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Distinguished Fellow of CSEP and former Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission of India. Thank you so much, Montek, for being here. Sameer Shisodia is the CEO of Rainmatter Foundation, and Rainmatter Foundation is in the area of addressing issues related to climate change through the route of afforestation, ecological restoration, livelihoods, and the like. So thank you, Sameer, for being here. Over to you, Dr. Montek.
Thank you very much, Ravi, for that actually quite a comprehensive introduction. It allows me to skip a lot of introduction that I would have done myself. As you've already heard, it is a huge subject. And I was a bit concerned that in a 40-minute talk, how on earth can I reasonably expect to cover everything that has to be covered? So I'm going to just say that, look, I'm going to sketch the ground and leave it either to the discussion with Sameer a little later, that things I don't adequately bring out are brought out, or to the question and answer session. But the most important thing is that this is a problem which is now recognized. That's a very crucial thing, because for a very long time, the approach in developing countries was that, look, it's a huge problem, but global warming takes place basically when the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere rises. And if you don't want global warming to take place, don't add any more CO2. It's not a question of reducing CO2, it has to be net zero, simply because CO2 sticks around for hundreds of years. So whatever the present level of CO2 is, there's a small amount you can add, which is what the Earth system would absorb anyway. But beyond that, no net addition is possible. And that's quite a humongous obligation, because after all, our concept of development includes energy, and our traditional source of energy has been fossil fuels. And so the idea that we are going to do without any emissions at all, developing countries quite rightly said that, look here, to the developed countries, you fellows have caused the concentration to rise as much as it has. And really, it's now our turn to develop, and you can't stop us. So you, by all means, go down, should go down. And indeed, they may actually have to go to negative if that is even conceptually possible, but don't put any limits on us. Now, this approach, which was followed for many, many years by developing countries, including India, became no longer viable once technology changed to make it possible to get energy from renewable sources. So it was no longer the argument that we need energy, therefore we have to have emissions, because the argument became that technology has now made it possible to have renewable energy which doesn't have any emissions. So the target for you is to switch your energy infrastructure to become almost entirely dependent on renewable energy. And it was in that framework that developing countries were persuaded to accept some limits. Now, the developed countries agreed to go to net zero in 2050. Developing countries quite rightly said that, look, one of the elements of equity must be that we must get there later than you, and so we will get there a little bit later. India was completely resistant to accepting any limit, any target date for net zero. But in COP26 in Glasgow, that's when the Prime Minister for the first time said, okay, we accept 2070 as the target date for net zero, which was actually appreciated because it did indicate a huge change from our traditional position. And now many developing countries have also set these targets. Now, one background thing that I have to mention is that the context in which these targets were set was a context in which the global target was to limit the increase in temperature above pre-industrial level. I mean, the base is the pre-industrial level, which is about 1880 or something. That the increase in temperature beyond that level earlier was said should not exceed 2 degrees centigrade, but then it was said, no, it should be only 1.5 degrees centigrade, simply because there are many island nations which would just go under if the temperature went up to 2 degrees centigrade. I mean, simply the rise in sea level as a result of glacier melt would pretty much wipe out many of these small states. So as a kind of a concession to them, the 1.5 degrees C was made the target. Though, most reliable people, most knowledgeable people say that none of the scientists really expects that 1.5 degrees C will be achieved. So they think that maybe something like 2, maybe a little more than 2 is what we're aiming at. And even to do that, we haven't got in place a set of commitments which will achieve it. So the present commitments are inadequate even to achieve a 2-degree limit. And what this does to the small island states, I won't go into. It's a big problem, but the world will somehow have to cope with it. Right now, the issue is that, a rise in temperature of 2 degrees C is not a uniform rise of 2 degrees C for the whole world. It'll rise more than that in some parts of the world and less than that in other parts of the world, and do more damage in some parts of the world than in other parts of the world. I mean, very roughly, the increase in temperature for India would end up being more like 2.8 degrees centigrade for a global rise of 2 or maybe a little above 2. And even within India, there'll be differences in regions, some parts getting really hot and others maybe not that hot. So one thing is what it'll do on the temperature front. The other thing is what's it going to do on the sea level front? Because, a rise of temperature of that kind will accelerate glacial melt in the polar ice caps and also in the Himalayas. This is actually going to lead to all this melted glaciers will end up, most of it in the sea, so rising sea levels, which is going to make the coastal areas very highly vulnerable. I mean, definitely in the Sundarbans area, it's mainly a problem for Bangladesh, but also a problem for us. You might see very substantial displacement of population. I'm not talking about what will happen over a 30, 40-year period, not something that's going to happen tomorrow. And that's one of the reasons that nobody pays any attention to it. I mean, most politicians in any country, not just India, do not have a time horizon beyond the next election. So to say to someone, what are you going to do about this over the next 40 years? I mean, the general attitude is, don't bother me too much. I've got other things to think about. But still, if you're really interested in society, that is an issue we need to think about. And agricultural productivity will be very badly affected. Now for us, in addition, what global warming will do, it will increase the total level of evaporation. And that is also going to lead to a change in the monsoon pattern. And that I'm getting all this from the scientists. I spent a very nice morning today with the Indian Institute of Science, sort of refreshing my knowledge of it. So what I'm saying now is based on what they more or less confirmed, that you're going to see a huge increase, you can say increased precipitation. I mean, contrary to the general view that there may be less precipitation, no, there'll be more precipitation, but it will be much more variable with more frequent droughts and much more frequent flooding. And this actually means that, we will not be able to to store the extra water when you have extra water, but we'll suffer from the lack of water when you have a drought. And therefore, you need to handle that problem through other aspects of adaptation and so on. Now, that's a very big agenda. What is it that we can do? Now, here, I think we can basically say that, look, recognizing that we are one of the most seriously affected, we also have to recognize that we cannot alter the pace at which global warming will take place. I mean, if we do what is ideal, global warming will still take place if the rest of the world doesn't do what is ideal. But the only way we can credibly pressurize the rest of the world is to say, well, look, we're doing what we promised. Now you do what you're supposed to be doing. The world doesn't always do that. I mean, in the reaction to the the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Europeans have just reversed everything compared to what they were promising. I mean, the original idea was we must get away from fossil fuels. The Ukraine war created artificial scarcity of fossil fuels. Instead of saying, this is an opportunity to accelerate getting away from them, what the Europeans have done is say, okay, the Russians are stopping the supply of gas, so we're going to produce more coal. I mean, completely the wrong decision. But maybe that's a 1 year slippage, 2 year slippage, whatever. Bottom line really is that we all need to get away from fossil fuels. Now, can we do that? I mean, I think that we can, simply because there are a range of things we can do, and these vary across sectors. So I just want to give a very rough idea of what the sectors are and how important they are. So I list 4 broad groups of sectors. One is the power sector, which today accounts for 50% of emissions, 50%. The next is the industry sector, which accounts for 32% of the emissions. The third is the transport sector, which accounts for 16% of the emissions. That's all the use of diesel and petrol and all that kind of stuff. And the last one is buildings and appliances, which account for 5%. Now, I'm not including in this agriculture, which generates methane, which is also a problem, though not perhaps in the same degree as CO2, but we'll come to that later if we have time. So clearly, if you want to cut CO2 and you want to cut it to zero by 2070, then, as Ravi explained, 2070 is a long way away, but you've got to be showing some progress in the big sectors where you're using fossil fuels, and those are power generation, the big industries, and transport. So what can we do in these areas? Well, in the case of the power sector, I've already said that what we have to do is to have some ambitious targets which will move us away from coal and towards renewables. Now, we have announced a national target of something like 450 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. The target for 2022 was 175 gigawatts. Now, this is quite an ambitious target because, only 10 years ago, our total renewables were probably less than 12. So going up to 175 was a pretty big step. But, we haven't done it. I mean, at the end of 2022, we will probably achieve about 125 gigawatts. So, when you hear people saying how well India is doing, you can paint 2 different scenarios. One is we've gone from 10 gigawatts to 120 gigawatts in 2022. That looks very impressive. That is impressive because not that many countries have done that. But that's not the point. If we want to achieve our target, then we should have been 175 gigawatts, and we're nowhere near that. What is more, by 2030, we have to be 450 gigawatts. So given the slippage that has already occurred in the 2022 target, in the next 8 years, we have to increase the capacity in terms of gigawatts of renewable energy, something like, from 120 to 450. That's 330 gigawatts in this very short space of time. Are we going to be able to do it? Well, obviously, we've done better than we did in the past. That's very often the case when we think of our own performance. we've done better than in the past. But that's not the target. The objective is, can you achieve the target you have now set? And I think we should recognize that in 2022 we didn't. Now, we must also allow for the fact that we had a pandemic. So, the last 2 years, it can be said that many, many things got disrupted. So we need not panic. But there should be no doubt in anyone's mind that 450 gigawatts not going to be achieved automatically. It's going to require a very big effort. Now, first question that people should ask is that, look, is it economic? I mean, you keep hearing that, coal is very inexpensive. Why are we shifting to renewables, etc.? Now, the facts are that at the moment, the technology changes that have occurred in renewable generation have made the production of renewable energy cost effective compared to new coal plants, providing you are not bothered about balancing the electricity supply. The problem with renewables is that you have peaks and you have troughs. But since the demand for electricity is for a more steady demand, offering sort of so many gigawatts at a certain price, but with a great fluctuation in between, doesn't help the electricity system. You have to build into that some element of stabilization. And that element of stabilization involves either you combine renewable electricity with pumped hydro, which is being done in some states, or you introduce utility scale batteries so that the peak production, part of it is put into batteries, which can then be released in non-peak hours. So this will actually increase the cost of supply of renewable energy beyond the coal. A lot of people would say that the reason coal appears to be cheap is because you are not factoring in the social cost of coal. I mean, the social cost of coal is clearly that it's adding to CO2, which is causing all these other damages. Now, part of the problem there is that that social cost is not internal to India. The benefits of India getting out of coal accrues to the whole world, not to India alone. Equally, when the rest of the world gets out of coal, we get a benefit. So our willingness to achieve the switch is linked to a kind of global compact that everybody is going to reduce their dependence on coal. And we have to recognize that we must, so to speak, pay the additional cost because we're also getting a benefit. But quite apart from CO2, getting away from coal has a huge gain in terms of pollution, which is not factored into our thinking. I mean, this morning at the Indian Institute, I had confirmed by some of the experts in this area, that if you calculate what the pollution cost of using coal is, you're talking about cutting about 8 years in terms of life expectancy for Indians. Now, that's not all because of coal pollution, that's because of our air pollution being above tolerable limits. So we need to address that, and the benefit of that is internal to our society. And one way of reflecting all this is you put a tax on carbon. That is what is being recommended by many people, though to be fair, none of the governments of the world are at the moment trying to do it, although the Europeans are introducing some kind of internal carbon pricing based on carbon trading. And what they're saying is that, look, other countries that don't do this, we will impose a duty on their goods when they're imported into Europe. So you're faced with a choice. Europeans are imposing a carbon tax. The US is not so far. And what the Europeans are saying is, look, in order to level the playing field, if you don't impose a carbon tax, well, we will just impose an additional import duty on your products when they're exported. So there is an economic case for arguing or considering whether we should go for a carbon tax or not. Whether it should be a carbon tax or carbon trading, that's another area which can be discussed. But this is a new area which is actually controversial. I mean, one of our problems, I think, is that if you have the chance of addressing Parliament, and I hope that some of you will, and you were to say that we must make every effort to cut down pollution and carbon dioxide generation, you'll get loud applause. And if you then say, and this is best done by raising the price of carbon by introducing a tax, you'll be booed. So there's a complete disconnect between the enthusiastic adoption of a slogan and the willingness to support the action needed to realize the results. Now, this is something that organizations like the BIC, etc., you've got to create a public awareness. Politicians should not be blamed for doing something which the public, doing something other than what the public is willing to tolerate. They do have a role in educating the public, but this one is a really tough one. So I think the issue that comes up in the Indian switch to renewables is, A, are we willing to, if you like, internalize the cost of coal through some form of rise in price of coal, through carbon taxation or not? Second, and this is equally important, our distribution companies are practically all of them broke. Now, to achieve the transition that we are talking about, we will have to do a massive investment. Estimates of the financing required for energy and other sectors suggest that we may need to have additional investment of almost 3% of GDP. That's not all in power, but somewhere the society must be ready to make that investment. Nobody thinks that this is going to be done by the public sector. So the whole assumption is that private sector generators will come in and set up plants and sell to electricity companies, which will then distribute. But they are not going to be interested in doing that if the financial condition of the discoms is what it is. And I don't want to go into that at great length. It varies by state. But in many of the states, the financial condition of the discoms is appalling. So the idea that we will get all this investment from the private sector and they will set up these plants and then they will sell to the distribution companies is just pie in the sky. Nor is it a solution to say it must be done by the public sector, because the public sector is more broke than the discoms. No state government is capable of mobilizing the resources needed to do this investment. They are using all their money in order to pay interest on public debt or a lot of these revenue expenditures that they have to incur. So I think the transition we are talking about is possible, but it requires some tough decision making. Now, one of the obvious things is that the electricity prices that we charge should be economic. They should reflect the cost of producing electricity. If you want to subsidize certain categories of the public, that's fine. You can always do that within your financial capability. But by and large, the public must be made willing to accept the fact that they have to pay for electricity. It's not a free good, nor is it a good that the state can subsidize across the board. I think there's also a question of public sector versus private sector efficiency. Now, I come from Delhi, where they privatized the distribution system 10, 15 years ago. And at that time, the distribution loss, the aggregate technical and commercial loss, was as much as 40%. After privatization, it's gone down to 7%. So, as the same culture, same people, the guys are quite happy, people are happily paying, etc. When I was in the Planning Commission, I had recommended to the then government of Karnataka that you should privatize distribution in Bangalore. I see Mr. Jairaj nodding his head because he must have heard me give that lecture at that time. And then many other states, private distribution companies are not unique. Ahmedabad is privatized, Surat is privatized, Bombay is privatized, Delhi is privatized, Calcutta is privatized. Now, if all this is so, why? My view was that state governments, I recognize that you cannot privatize the whole distribution system. It would become too politically a hot potato. But what is wrong with choosing 2 or 3 cities in each state and privatizing the distribution system to set a benchmark for the rest of the system that, look, if these fellows can do it, why can't you do it? And I think something like that needs to be pushed. Now, this may look very different, very distant from the objective of controlling climate change, but it's not. Unless you get an improvement in the public distribution system, there is not a dog's chance of achieving the investment that we need in renewable energy. That's a huge challenge, and I call on BIC to support sensible policy action in this area. Now, I think that's for power. One of the other things we have to do is that, if we are moving away from fossil fuel-based electricity generation, which lends itself to a steady supply of electricity, to renewables which have variability, then however much you do balancing, the objective really is to shift demand as much as possible towards the period of peak production of renewable energy, and to shift supply perhaps to the periods where the demand is also peaked. Now, the best way of doing that is to have variable pricing, intraday variation in pricing. Now, we do have that, but the variation is very small. It's like as if people have said, oh yes, we have intraday variation, and peak periods a little higher and other periods a little lower. But maybe you need a much more scientific approach to how much variation do you need. And this, again, is a lot of public education that is necessary. Remember, for people who are heavily intensive in using appliances and so forth, as you moved into the world of the Internet of Things, it's possible to think over the next 20 years that a lot of people who will be using appliances will be able to program the appliances so that they come into operation actually when prices are very low. And so we have to think afresh, not like a developing country, but looking at what is now possible and is being practiced in developed countries and see whether we can implement it or not. So it requires a complete revamping of the regulatory system. The state regulatory authority that fixes prices needs to be massively modernized and its capabilities greatly strengthened. Now I don't know if I'm probably over, I don't see him. Okay, industries. 30% of the emissions come from industries. These are, steel, cement, fertilizers, oil refining. There are no simple solutions here, because here except in small cases like electric arc furnaces and so on, you can't really replace the use of fossil fuels by electricity. You have to bring in green hydrogen. And the government has announced that it wants to encourage green hydrogen. Our private sector has made ambitious claims that they will, in fact, go in for green hydrogen. What the government has done is they've set a regulatory standard that your percentage use of green hydrogen should increase to X% over a certain period. The effectiveness of this is going to depend very critically on whether they can reduce the cost of production of green hydrogen. And that transition actually means a lot of investment in electrolyzers, in electrolyzer technology, and in bringing in renewable energy to run these things. So basically, that transition is a little uncertain, but we can assume that at the end of the next 10 years, we'll have a better idea. Remember, we want to get to net zero by 2070, so everything doesn't have to be done in the next 10 years. One of my main messages here is that we should not pretend that we can define a precise target all the way up to 2070. We should recognize that the first thing to do is to have a credible target for the next 10 years, identifying those sectors where we can really show some progress, make a granular indication of how much progress. For example, in power, when are we going to peak the production of coal? I don't think we can peak it before 2030, but could we peak it by 2035? So we need to have, over the next 10 years, a clear indication that the use of coal is going to increase for the next X number of years, reach a peak, and then start coming down. That way, the coal ministry can plan, as it were, to phase out its coal production. This is something that, I mean, if any of you became coal minister, this is not a question you will want to answer. When are you going to start phasing out coal production, shutting down coal mines? But let's face it, if we are going to get to net zero by 2070, there's no question that what is now 700 million tons of coal production has to go down quite sharply, maybe after 2035. So this needs to be worked out. How do we do this phasing out? And then I think that way, over the next 10 years, we can say that, look, in these sectors, there will be measurable progress. In some others, we may have to wait for a little while. Let me also now just turn a little bit to transport, which is actually much more feasible and also happening. We break down transport into railways and passenger transport. You know, in the case of the railways are already, the track is almost completely electrified, okay? But electrifying the track is not the same thing as electrifying traction, because we have a lot of diesel engines. As a matter of fact, we have a factory that was inaugurated just 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, producing diesel engines for the next 10 years or so. So we need to decide, when are we going to phase out these diesel engines? I see in the newspapers very often an announcement that the railways are going to go net zero by 2030. I don't know exactly what is meant by that. But the fact is, if the railways want to go net zero by 2030, the first thing they should do is to outline what is their plan for phasing out diesel traction. You know, one solution could be that you do some collaborative work to convert the diesel engines into electric engines. That can be done. The factory that exists, we can negotiate with the factory that, look, technology now exists for electric locomotives. We don't want you to produce diesel locomotives, produce electric locomotives. To do that, you'll have to renegotiate the contract you have with them. And that will raise the problem that it will not be, you can't do it by competitive bidding because you'll be negotiating with one supplier. So somebody has to make that decision. But unless we do that, we cannot really say that we are electrifying the railways. And yet, you know, frankly, shifting transport away from road transport to rail is one of the best things that we could do to reduce emissions, because railway transport is much more effective. Goods transport is much more effective and efficient than road transport. Coming to road passenger transport, obviously everybody talks about electric vehicles. You know, you often hear that the number of electric vehicles, it is increased. That's good. But you know, the question we have to ask ourselves is that if you want to go to net zero by, let us say, 2070, when will the entire passenger fleet in the country become electric? Because unless it's electric, then some carbon dioxide will be produced. So maybe if you say that, look, by 2060 or so, the entire car fleet in the country should be electric. What that really means, since it takes about 15 years to phase out a car, that really means that from 2045 onwards, there should be no internal combustion engine passenger car sold. Now, whether it's 2045 or 2040, this is something that planners should work out. But to my mind, it's important for the government to announce now that after this date, there will be no sale allowed of ICE vehicles. Or alternatively, if you still produce ICE vehicles, then maybe for another 5 years, you can sell them at a much higher duty, which will be imposed. So that will be a price disincentive. But you better start retooling to produce electric vehicles. So for that, you need a clear signal. And when that signal is there, then you can monitor how the annual sale of electric vehicles is performing compared to the target. See, at the moment, too many people get very enthused that we are selling more electric vehicles. We will sell more electric vehicles. But the question is, are we getting to the point where 100% of Indian vehicles sold will be electric by some date, 2040, 2040, whatever it is? And then trace out a curve, and against that curve measure whether there's enough progress. And part of the problem is, as in so many dimensions in life, you know, we will be getting better a little bit every year. I mean, that's not surprising. The real question is, are we getting better fast enough? And for that, you need to have some granular targets fixed. And I think here, it's not just electric vehicles. You have to solve the problem of a charging infrastructure. Where are these electric vehicles going to get recharged? That requires a lot of coordination between the electricity company. I mean, in London, for example, in central London, every other lamppost has a sort of a charging facility where somebody parks his car can charge it. So maybe in Bangalore, you should sort of set a target that we need so many target sort of plugging points, which could be linked to the existing electric poles in the street, so that as people move to electric vehicles, they can actually charge. Now, initially, this is going to require some extra cost because it won't be cost effective. Because you'll have to have these things before people buy the cars, which means that for the first 2-3 years, they may not be utilized enough. But that's what a public utility does. I mean, you set up the infrastructure and then the rest will follow. So I think we need to build at the state level, at the municipal level, an understanding of what is needed and quantify that and then monitor it. And I think that, this is my, and much the same holds for buildings and appliances. You could set standards, for example, that all new buildings must meet certain new standards that will ensure much better energy efficiency. I mean, the scope for saving energy through better building design is actually quite substantial. And the IPCC has estimated that, almost 30% of the transition that we need is going to come through increased energy efficiency, not just the switch to renewable, but actually increased energy efficiency. Now, part of that story is that energy efficiency will be increased if energy prices are increased. I mean, this is a classic case, for example, that when we increase the effort to expand LEDs, the government heavily subsidized the LEDs and the number of LED bulbs expanded rapidly. They tried to do the same thing with fans. There are energy efficient fans, but they're not being subsidized. I mean, I can understand that. And most people are not willing to pay more for an energy efficient fan because the break-even point is about 4 to 5 years. And the realization that is worth doing just isn't there. Also, in ordinary households, the price of electricity for the lower levels of electricity consumption is too low. Whereas if you're consuming an air conditioner, then generally you're in an area in a household where the price of electricity becomes high. So the role of prices in pushing people in the right direction is actually quite important. But there's a lot of resistance to raising any price. That's just one example. So I think what this really says is that there's no single solution. You have to operate at multiple levels. You have to operate in multiple government levels. I mean, what you do for the railways can only be done by the central government. What you do for public transport, like putting in public buses, which are electric, can be done by the state government, but that too has to be done by the municipality, which has to be able to afford it. Now, today in Chennai and Mumbai and Delhi, you see newspapers saying so many thousand electric buses have been ordered, which is good. But the truth is that they need to order 10 times more buses than they have actually ordered. So what is happening is a sort of what you would call a naam ke vaste purchase of electric buses is being made. But a detailed granular plan would require that, look, if the name of the game is that 100% of Bangalore buses should be electric by some year, maybe 2030 or 2035, then for each of the next 10 years, you might buy so many thousand electric buses. To do that, you have to provide the funds. And most of the municipalities don't have their own funds, so the state government has to pitch in. So I think all of this has to be added up together. And the public has to be made aware of the fact that, look, we can solve a lot of these problems, but it's going to cost money. And there's no way that the money is going to be avoided, that the burden on the public is going to be reduced public will have to pay for this facility. And of course, the solution is getting rid of many other subsidies, which at the moment are wasteful, do not contribute to any kind of social good. And that's another very controversial issue, because in our system, short-term benefit subsidies get the maximum attention. Subsidies that will benefit over the long run get zero attention. So this is really where a greater awareness of the problem has to be brought in. Well, I think, do I have another 2 minutes, or am I overstepping? I'm probably overstepping. There's time? Okay. Just some numbers to make you understand the degree of the problem. See, an obvious question is that if we have to make this transition, we must restructure the energy and related infrastructure with new investment. I mean, the new investment of the next 20 years must be totally different from what it was before. By the way, getting that done in government is very difficult, in any government, because most governments are trained to replicate what they do. It would require leadership of the highest order in each government. I'm not just talking now about central government or state government, for the message to go out that, look, this is such a huge problem that you must have a plan totally different from what you had earlier. And if you don't have a plan that's totally different, you're adding to the problem, because you don't want to be burdened with the kind of infrastructure which is highly carbon intensive. That's a major change which can only come from the top in each government. Even if you do that, the additional investment that you need is about 3% of GDP. And that's not a small sum of money. But equally, the rate of investment has declined in the last 10 years by about 4% of GDP. So it's not as if we weren't investing. We were investing this much earlier. So we must ask ourselves, why has the investment rate gone down? How can we bring it up again? And when it goes up, it should go up in the right areas, not necessarily in what it was doing earlier. And not all of this investment is going to be in the public sector. Some is going to be in the private sector. If it's in the private sector, then the market must support. I mean, for example, if you're going to retool an automotive factory to EVs, that retooling is going to be done by the private sector, not by the government. But you have to ask yourself, what are the policy decisions that the government has to take to make it sensible for people to start investing in electric vehicles? And clearly, building a charging infrastructure in advance is a very important signal. So you need to separate out what's the private sector going to do and what's the public sector going to do. In this whole process, you shouldn't think that the private sector will do everything. A lot of this infrastructure has got to be done by the public sector, particularly when you get into adaptation. Climate change is already taking place, and even if we achieve the net zero by 2070, between now and then, more global warming will occur. So the real question is, are we doing what is necessary to cope with the effects of this climate change? That requires a lot of investment in things like afforestation, which can only come from the public sector. And frankly, that is an area where our record is appalling. Because what has happened is that we have steadily decreased the area under forests. In the last 3 or 4 years, it is said that it has slightly gone up. But this hides the fact that the quality of forest cover is deteriorating. So from the point of view of carbon sequestration, it's not the area covered alone, it's the quality of the area. If dense forests are kind of becoming less dense, then they're not absorbing as much carbon dioxide as they should. So the question we have to ask is, if the usual answer in government is that, look, you must fund the existing program more. The fact is the existing program isn't delivering what it was meant to deliver. So somebody must ask the question, if you really have to get different results in afforestation, what is it that you need to do now? And there are lots of civil society organizations who work on forests. You need to get from them a sense of what is it that would make a difference which hasn't worked before. So I think many of these issues get tied up with financing, and then you have to sort of take a comprehensive view of how that would work. I mentioned adaptation, and let me just say that there are two areas that will be absolutely crucial. One is water. While the total amount of water that we get is not going to be reduced, much more of it is going to run off into the sea because the precipitation is going to be concentrated. That the only way you can stop that is if you do enough afforestation so that the water is held back before it goes down into the river. Now, that is a huge task, and we need to sensitize government. But you can see that that's a very long-term thing. I mean, it takes 10, 12 years for a forest to look like a reasonable forest. So somebody must have that, it must generate the enthusiasm that that kind of quantitative target is seen by the public to be of value, and the government then gets the credit for having done it, planted so many thousand trees or million trees, etc., etc. I mean, I've been hearing about this for the last 30 years, let me tell you. I mean, living as I do in Delhi, I mean, I don't know for how long we've been hearing that the Aravali must be afforested. It's not being afforested. So, but it can be done. But it can be done only if the government's concerned, both the center and the state, first recognize that whatever they're doing isn't working. And therefore come back and say, well, look, we're going to do it differently. I mean, unless you say that, I don't know if it was Einstein who said the definition of insanity is you keep doing the same thing but expect to get different results. That applies very much in these areas. Yes, and the other is city infrastructure. I mean, failure to manage water, encroachment of areas where water would actually otherwise be accumulated. At Bangalore, I mean, you had 8 lakes at one time, beautifully linked with each other, and they've been allowed to be more or less destroyed, so I'm told. Similarly, in Chennai, overbuilding in the lowland areas, that has to all dramatically change, and it will require essentially a combination of tough regulation and public sector investment. See, otherwise, we will just keep getting hit by huge floods. I mean, I mentioned in the Indian Institute of Science that, look, we've seen a terrible flood in Pakistan, which affected 30% of the population. It didn't mean they were all badly affected, but they were all affected. I don't think we're going to get those kinds of floods in India, I was told, and that's very reassuring. That's because Pakistan is especially vulnerable to the glacial melt that takes place in the Indus Valley rivers, whereas the southern rivers, which really are ours, that's not so much of a problem. But in low-lying areas in Chennai, even in parts of Mumbai, if we don't take action, we could have very serious problems. So, I mean, I personally think that we need both a national plan, which articulates a sectoral detail for the next 10 years, a state-level plan, which articulates a sectoral detail which is relevant for state-level decision-making. Every state should actually have a 10-year plan, its 10-year plan for climate change. And in a way, the national plan becomes the center's plan plus the aggregation of state plans. So those of you that are active, and I'm sure you're all very influential, you should encourage Karnataka to produce a state-level plan. I think in Tamil Nadu, they've announced something, a kind of state mission for climate change. We have to see how good it is. The other thing is that it's very easy to announce, it's very easy to write plans. I mean, I've been deputy chairman of the Planning Commission, and we've been writing plans. We have hundreds of people who've been writing plans for the last 50 years. The fact that you have written something and called it a plan is of no consequence whatsoever. It's the quality of the plan that matters. And I want to end this on a little personal note, brings in the experience of my wife, who was referred to. She was very concerned that, city development was being pushed without much regard for the environmental damage that the proposed development would cause. And so at one point, I think she was made, amicus curiae for the court on something which they were saying, CSOs were saying that this plan is no good and should be rejected. So she was asked to comment on it. And she discovered that the consultant who had prepared the plan had copy-pasted into the Delhi plan whole paragraphs from a Chennai plan. You know, it was a fat document of 40 pages. It was called the Environment Impact Assessment Plan. But the quality of these out there, and basically, if you say no progress is possible without a quality, without an environment impact assessment program, you'll get an environment assessment program that any number of consulting firms for a very modest fee will provide it, especially if they're just copy pasting from other city plans. You need a system that can technically appraise these things and decide whether they're any good or not. It was amazing to see that, and I can see that replicated for the next several years. So with those words, thank you for inviting me to speak. I apologize if I've spoken too much, and now look forward to being put on the mat by Sameer. Okay? Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I think, is it okay if I call you Montek, although you're my father's
Absolutely.
age? I think he's covered in 45 minutes what it's taken me 2 years to arrive at in a lot of conversations, research, travel across the country and so on. So thank you so much for that. I have about 2.5 hours of questions for him. So I'm not sure where to start. I tried to summarize it, but that became a whole bunch of questions again. So let me just ask the simplest one first. Are you on climate change? Are you an optimist or are you a pessimist that we'll actually do something about it?
You know, I'm reminded of the definition that a pessimist is an optimist who knows better. So I think, no, look, I'm optimistic. I'm generally an optimist. And I think when you look back on our history for the last 30 years, we have responded to problems. We probably responded late. We haven't responded enough, but we have responded. And performance after our response, in most cases, has been better than it was before, but it was not up to what is needed. So I'm sure in climate change, you're going to get the same thing. But you know, right now, I would break this into a bite-sized set of objectives. First, can we agree on when we are going to phase out the use of coal for power? And in the first instance, it means can we agree on when coal for power will peak and then start to go down? Planning whether it will go to zero or not will come later. The growth of confidence, if we can show that we can peak, will be very substantial. Similarly, in the case of the railways, I think the government is in a position to produce a credible action plan which will demonstrate the extent to which railway traction will become electric over what period. It can't be by 2030, but can it be by 2035? That would be a huge change. And similarly, in the case of electric vehicles, two-wheelers, three-wheelers, four-wheelers, you know, at the moment, about 2% in number are electric. And in China, it's 16 or 17%. Let's always keep in mind what others are doing. I think we tend to sort of get too impressed by ourselves when we use only ourselves as the benchmark. So use some other countries also. I think if we could set a target that, look, as far as two and three-wheelers are concerned, by 2035, let's say, X% of new sales will be electric. And for these categories, no ICE vehicles will allow to be sold by some date. Government has to discuss with, and do the same thing for four-wheelers. And then demonstrate that, look, we can meet these targets. Some of the other stuff, you know, like the hard-to-abate areas, industries, green hydrogen, that will take some time because we don't really know yet at what cost the green hydrogen can be produced. I have no doubt that it's going to become cheaper because it's not just India's problem. I mean, the whole world is trying to do the same thing. So sooner or later, better technology will exist, and if we are smart enough to take the best technology wherever it is, wherever it exists, and collaborate with those who have access to that technology, we can break that also. But these are the low-hanging fruits, and we should first demonstrate that we can do something in those areas. And finally, I think in urban infrastructure and what we do for water, I mean, certainly, an aggressive and sensible program of afforestation and conservation of water, combined with, in the major cities that are vulnerable to flooding, a really serious effort to tackle that problem would go a long way. It will create confidence. I think at the moment the problem is lack of confidence. People don't believe that when the government says anything, it'll do it.
Yeah, I think so. That's the pessimism part of the optimistic in you.
That's the what?
That's the pessimistic part of the optimistic in you.
No, it's not pessimistic, it's realistic. I mean, look, if you're not realistic, you'll never achieve anything. The worst outcome is the person who believes, I have identified the problem, I have asked someone to produce a plan, here is the plan, now let's not worry about it. In fact, you should subject every plan to the most critical, independent view, assessment. It will help the government. And in fact, government, in my view, should say that, look, this is a very complicated business. We don't have any parallels to go by. The so-called successful countries have done all the wrong things. And as the Ukraine example shows, they continue to do the wrong thing. So in the absence of success elsewhere, I mean, internal criticism is a very important thing. And we should emphasize. That's not being pessimistic. That's, I think, being realistic.
Thanks. I'm hesitating to get to the next question because the man sitting next to me, he was in the newspapers as we were growing up through India's economic growth. So, are we getting it wrong? Because you're sitting in the city of, Bangalore is defined by disruption. The whole startup space is defined by disruption. We have seen many an old technology, many an old company die in the recent past, in the valley here in Bangalore and so on and so forth. Is climate change disrupting everything we know while we are trying to tweak at the edges, at the fringes of it? Do we have to, does a 16-year-old share our views on this in terms of, EVs will be enough, solar is going to be enough, without actually asking the hard questions about, did we create the underlying structures wrong? Did we, are our cities, and not just our cities anymore, are our villages, our supply chains just too energy hungry at this point of time? Are we ready to, is that even a part of the conversation? Is that conversation something we can have with with not just the governments, but industry, and I would say everybody who's over 40 years old, that includes I?
No, I would certainly hope that we can have that conversation. Such conversations can be structured only if governments put out what their plan is and point out that, look, these are the difficult choices. And if you don't make these difficult choices, the end result is not going to work. I mean, look, the simplest thing I gave was, is there any earthly reason why every state should not privatize electricity distribution in 2 or 3 of its major cities, if only to set a benchmark for the rest of the system to achieve? Now, if Delhi ran a loss rate of 45% or something like that, and has reduced it now to 7%, isn't that an example of what can be done? But yet we don't see it happening.
Just to comment on that one, for instance, on electricity, our thinking is still megawatt plants, right? When we are talking about renewables, which are basically incident everywhere, the conversation on DRE has been extremely difficult in India, and it's something that's a lot more efficient. It's a lot more distributed, so resilient. As it's managed at a local level, so it handles the demand side a lot better. There is enough evidence to prove that it's a major response. But why has it been such a difficult conversation to have in governance and in the larger narrative of the energy transition.
No, I don't. I haven't fully understood when you mean distributed. What exactly do you mean?
Microgrids, rooftop,
No,
produce it where you need it.
Very important issues in my view. And again, let's just take the rooftop solar, okay? The scope for that is huge. And in our targeting, we had, for that 175 gigawatts of renewables, there was a significant portion of rooftop solar, which has not been achieved at all. And the main reason is not achieved is that the electricity distribution fellows are not willing to do a kind of net metering. They basically are saying, okay, you can put up the rooftop solar, but you can just sell it to us at a certain price. Whereas, in fact, if you're charging very high prices for the household consumption, if you were to say that, look, you can do it on a net metering basis, they have a huge incentive to set up the solar solar facilities themselves. And that would, because the transmission is over a much smaller range, lots of real efficiencies. So frankly, I think the unwillingness to rationalize pricing is what forces the distribution companies to take this position. The distribution companies say, you're forcing us to charge very low prices for large numbers of people. Therefore, we can only survive if we charge very high prices to the richer fellows, and they will try to avoid those very high prices by building solar. That will help the system, but it won't help my finances, and therefore I don't agree. Now we have to make up our mind, either we get rid of this distortion, or we just tell them that no, we'll do something about your pricing, but don't stop the setting up of solar plants, rooftop solar.
On this economics versus ecology question, right? And this is a question that has bothered us in a lot of conversations. And since I have one of the best economic brains in the country next to me, there's this framing of economy as a subset of society and as a subset of the larger ecology. Is it even possible to solve it through financial and economic means without acknowledging that your economy is essentially like a small annuity of the larger ecosystem? Is there a lack of acceptance that this can hit a cliff and we can fall off it, like Pakistan did, and Europe has been seeing, and North America seeing right now, and the costs are way beyond the 3% that you were mentioning?
Well, that's a very good question. Look, one thing, let's be clear. Pakistan deserves a lot of sympathy for the mess that they're in. The only thing you can say is it's of their own making. One thing you must say is that we are not in that kind of a mess. Look, we had a problem in 1991. Now, whatever you may say about the system, we have not run into a similar problem since then. We have not needed to go to the IMF since 1991. That is 30 plus years ago, okay? So the idea, and there are many countries that have routinely gone back to the IMF every 5 or 6 years. We haven't done that. So some credit must be given to the system that it was able to learn a lesson. And my guess is that today, I'm pretty sure that whatever happens, I don't think that the central government will make the mistake of an unchecked expansion of the fiscal deficit. Some people will urge it to do so, but if you look at the totality of comment, I think there isn't enough strength, in my view, in the argument that you should reduce the fiscal deficit. That's what we should be doing. But I don't think anyone would support an expansion of the fiscal deficit. By contrast, in Pakistan, the discipline has been zero.
Yes, but on the ecological side,
Yes.
what sort of a ecological fiscal deficit? For instance, you are part of the TN Council for Climate Change right now. What kind of a calculation goes into acknowledging the ecological deficit that TN does face today, while it's racked up great numbers on the economic side?
Well, although I'm a member of that council, I don't think we've not yet had a formal meeting to discuss these issues, though they have declared some kind of a climate plan, and presumably there will be a meeting to discuss the quality of that plan. But many of the issues that I've talked about are part of that plan. Now, how well it gets implemented is a real issue. And this is always the problem, that you can always formulate a plan and say some nice things, but you need to be a pretty hard-headed person to signal a warning that, look, it was a great plan, but you're departing from it massively. And if they build in the kind of internal correctives that send these warning signals, and if society is adequately aware of reminding the government that, look, you said this and this is what you're doing and this is not consistent, then there is some hope that we may be able to do something. Remember, it's relatively easy to tell the government not to do something which will cause an immediate damage. Okay? But the trouble with climate change is the damage may come 5 years, 10 years, 15 years later. Secondly, the damage may not come in this narrow area that you're talking about. It's through some various interconnection, comes somewhere else. That's why you need a high quality plan which takes account of this, and then you can monitor each bit of the plan to see, are you doing what you said you would do? I mean, for example, they have said, I think they have said, that Chennai Corporation will have so many thousand electric vehicles. Now, if the people kind of insist on that you must deliver this and give it high priority, then sooner or later, state governments will have to find money from somewhere, and maybe stop the losses that otherwise eat up resources, or restructure their subsidies when they're not very productive, etc., etc. That's the only thing that one can hope for.
So, do you think we will start responding when the numbers start to add up on the hit from the climate disasters that we're already starting to see?
Well, I would. Look, that's the only hope that you have. Look, in a democratic setup, governments are held responsible for what people expect them to do, especially in the light of what they've committed to do. Now, if no government has made a commitment to do something, then you can't expect anyone to respond. But if a government has analytically said that in order to make X and Y and so on, social indicators better, we must do A, B, and C, then you need a watchful civil society that measures whether the government is achieving that. Now, quite frankly, if they're achieving it and the thing still isn't working, that's telling you that you've got to look deeper. We've had this experience before, because, way back in 1991, the presumption was that the problem is children are not enrolled in school, so we must increase enrollment, otherwise how are we going to get education? And we did achieve the high enrollment. But then it turned out that the kids that were being enrolled weren't learning anything. They were just going to school, having their midday meals, and 40% of the kids in every class were not able to meet the standards they should have met 2 years earlier. So then the attention began to focus on why is it that you've built the schools, you've hired the teachers, but you're not getting education. So that's the next stage. But I think you need a watchful society. Look, if between a state that didn't build the schools and a state that built the schools and the kids are not learning, there is some progress, because then you know where to look for in the answers.
Yeah, I think the big difference in climate is that we have maybe a decade to turn the ship around.
Yeah, it's a much longer term, thing.
Thank you so much. I'll open it up for audience questions. I have a question of the audience to start with. How many people here are actually optimistic that we will disrupt climate change before it disrupts us?
All those who are optimistic, please raise your hands. It's a very important question. Well, it's reasonable. All those who are pessimistic, please raise your hands. Yeah, clearly outvoted by the pessimist. But can I pose a different question? All those who are optimistic that we will achieve our growth objectives, please raise your hands. No one's, again, all those who are pessimistic about growth, please raise your hands. So actually, the audience is just pessimistic. It is,
Welcome to Bangalore.
it is not a case that they're all growth oriented and therefore they don't care about the environment. They're just pessimistic about whatever objective you have. Okay.
Please state your name and if you represent an organization or.
Hi, I'm Tanuj Bhojwani. I'm just here because I'm curious. I wanted to ask you two questions related to two things you've done. One, in the power sector, the states don't pay the discoms on time. State finances are bad, discom finances are bad, but they're off the book balance sheets that I can hide my outstanding things on. Is that the primary driver? Yes, there are losses, but there's no investment, like you're saying. But the states, which consume a lot of electricity, don't pay. Is there anything we can do, or what this government is doing, which is basically bleeding them dry with the ISTS, captive power plant sector, and just making the discoms, crumble? Yeah. That's one. What's the alternative? The other is, you haven't spoken about global financing. Of course, we need a lot of investment, but NDCC everything is pointing to the idea that developed nations, those who have emitted carbon in the past, should be paying us. India is not getting its fair share of that NDCC, and for various reasons, but how much do you see them actually paying up, owning up?
Yeah, no, very good question. First, on the issue of what can we do if state governments don't pay what they're supposed to pay. I remain of the view that if you were to privatize the discoms, the pressure on the state government to deliver would increase. As long as the discoms are run by government civil servants, ex-civil servants or on deputation or whatever it is, you cannot expect them to make it difficult for the government. So if they say, but you haven't paid, and the government will say, yeah, I realize, but you understand and don't make a noise, they'll say, okay, we won't make a noise. The private sector won't do that. They'll lobby, they'll go to this minister, that minister, blame whoever's not performing, etc., etc. It's also the case that in the case of the private sector, some of them may just shut off electricity for government departments that don't pay. Now, I would not be in favor of shutting off electricity to a government hospital. But frankly, shutting off electricity to a lot of government ministries wouldn't do any damage at all. So, just the start that, look here, this is a business and you are, as a customer, you're buying electricity. If you're not willing to pay, don't get the electricity. I'm still of the view, and I've discussed this extensively with many friends, that in Bangalore, in Karnataka, let's just be particular about Karnataka, I would choose 2 cities, let's say, including Bangalore, and simply privatize the electricity distribution system for those 2 cities and wait and see at the end of 5 years whether these fellows do a good job or not. We underestimate the motivational factor pushing for a reasonable result. That just isn't there in the public sector when they're facing another public sector. I mean, public sector guys are quite happy to disconnect electricity to some rich people who are running air conditioners and not paying. But they're not prepared to do that for any government department or any other public sector company or any of that sort of stuff. So that's just one. The second was international. That's a very good question. And you asked, is there scope? Yes, there's scope. I think I've thought about it a little bit, and I think internationally, people say that, look, you fellows just want aid. And this is not an aid issue, because these are all economically viable transformations. And if it's economically viable, the market will support them. To some extent, that's true. I mean, for example, if we need a massive retooling of the automotive sector in order to start complying with new directions that 100% of vehicles should be electric, these fellows will find the money. Either their home factories or whatever the companies they are subsidiaries of, or just go to the capital market, they'll raise the money. But when it comes to afforestation, when it comes to building an energy responsive city infrastructure, there is no revenue model there. It has to be done by the public sector, and the public sector needs money. I think that we can use the multilateral development banks to actually provide. I mean, I've written about this in a paper which is somewhere on our website. We should triple. That's our recommendation. We triple the flow of money from multilateral development banks. But the key to that is that they should increase that flow combined with conditionality that will make sure that we do what is necessary. I mean, for example, the railways may need a certain amount of support to, for example, electrify diesel traction. I think the multilateral development banks should be willing to do that. Now, they would probably insist that we have a credible plan to do it, and there's nothing wrong with that. I don't think this has adequately been discussed yet. I'm hoping that now that we are, by rotation, we are the chair of the G20, this could be something that could come up. The present position is that the last meeting of the G20 summit in Indonesia gave a general direction to the multilateral development banks that you should do more. It didn't say triple, but just do more. And come back to us in time for the next spring meeting with what is your plan. So I think they will wait to see what the World Bank fellows come back with. I'm sure the World Bank fellows are trying to sniff around the US Treasury that, look, how much are you willing to do? Because after all, they're the most important, in that sense, voting shareholder. But in that process, we should create a very strong demand. We should create an environment in which the World Bank has to go back to the US and say, look, if we do less than this, we'll be regarded as a joke. Now, whether we are doing that or not, I can't say. But we're certainly arguing it. And I think there should be more of a public debate on this. The big question, though, is that this will all be conditional. This is not free money that you're just dishing out. I think one of the big problems has been that the developing countries have never pushed for additional flows from the multilateral development banks. They have pushed for additional flows from the UN, the Green Climate Fund. And the Green Climate Fund is a fund of $10 billion over 5 years. So they might make it 20 billion. But as Janet Yellen, the US Secretary of the Treasury said, they're talking billions when we need trillions. Now, I'm assuming that if she said that, that was a very strong signal. And if they fail to deliver trillions, then somebody should get up and say that, look, you should listen to the US Secretary of the Treasury if you don't want to listen to us. And that should be part of the public debate. Maybe it will be, I don't know.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that?
Sure.
Do you think if we get the money right now from what got announced at COP27 and earlier, do you think we know how to make best use of it? Because as I've traveled across, had conversations with folks in urban planning, in the agri sector, and so on and so forth. We know how to build infra with our money right now, but the infra doesn't add up too much, like you were saying about in a different context. There is very limited lack of systems thinking. There is very little understanding of life cycle analysis of pretty much anything that we plan out at this point of time. For instance, urban planning does not account for your geography or your ecology or the bioregional zone you're part of. Without getting this homework right, do you think we have the capacity to absorb this money right? Or we'll end up doing a lot more damage, have a lot of, the landscape is strewn with infra out there that doesn't serve its purpose at this point in time.
Well, the advantage of asking for the multilateral development banks to do it is they have the skill to know what is a good project and what is not. So I don't think we'll get away with wasting money. Now, they may also get it wrong because they may not, not only this is a new area. But let's take a simple thing, not a simple thing, but a traditional thing like a much expanded program of water conservation, okay? A much expanded program of afforestation, a much expanded urban program to deal with extreme weather events and flooding and so on. I mean, I think we have the capacity to do that. And there's no, I mean, whatever we do, these guys know how to benchmark what we're doing against what others are doing. Look, if you did a simple thing like, I mean, I don't see why, take sewage treatment, okay? I mean, I visited the Infosys facility in Mysore, and I see that Mr. Narayanmurthy is there because he took me there. And they have a very impressive sewage treatment plant which collects all the sewage from that plant, treats it, and puts it back in pretty good condition. Now, if you were to simply say, make a list of, the top 10 facilities in Karnataka, 10, 20, even 100, and say, look, how about, are you doing this? I mean, it's been done elsewhere, it can be done, the technology is there. And it's not going to solve the problem of Karnataka, but if we have a multiplication of successful micro initiatives, it will enthuse people. And that, I think, is the most important thing we need in this area. Certainly in afforestation, there's a lot of civil societies that are concerned about afforestation. And maybe they have different approaches. There's no reason why the state government couldn't say that we're willing to have an X $100,000, whatever, $1 million program over the next 5 years, and we'll experiment with 5 different ways of both regenerating forests and improving the density of forests and so on. Things that we haven't done. But in the past, the approach has been we must increase the budget of the forest department. Now, quite frankly, that is not going to solve the problem because it's got to be done differently. But how is it done differently? I don't know.
Hello, sir. My name is Nikhil Mantha. My late grandfather will be absolutely thrilled that I'm here asking you a question. So, question is quite simple. I think what struck me in your conversation was that if a politician needs to sign something that has a consequence in 2070, they'll ask for the pen. And that made a lot of sense. So here we have a very complex plan at a national, state, municipal level that needs to be executed across the decades, when especially governments are going to change at the center level and at the state level and at the municipal level. What suggestions would you give in probably setting up some framework of people, of institutions that would exist across the time to ensure that such a complex plan is executed? It could be something as simple as sensitizing the cadre of IAS, all the civil services, to creating a new branch of civil services specifically for this, to taking it to creating a very strong independent institution, probably like the Supreme Court or RBI. So spanning across, like this, I was thinking about this because I'm also a science fiction fan. So there's this book called Foundation by Asimov, where between two galactic empires, there's a lot of chaos, and there was this foundation that was set up to guide the galaxy across that chaos. So we have 50 years, and a lot of this is going to happen. So what is your advice or framework that needs to be set up to make this happen?
That is quite possibly too large a question for me to answer in a very quick way. But I think one of the most useful things is that you asked a question earlier that how do we make a plan that won't make a government just junk it, okay? Now, the truth of the matter is if we create a system where whatever is a plan has been well discussed and approved by a complex set of civil society organizations, and you create an environment in which changes have to then be discussed with the same group, governments are less likely to sort of suddenly change plans. I mean, they can always, given the plan, they can always blame their predecessors for doing it badly and say, look, we're going to do a much better job. That would be a sufficient challenge in terms of political incentive rather than junk a plan. But if the plan has just been produced internally at the whim of somebody, it's easy to junk it. But if you've gone through a process where you involved a whole lot of people, change of government means that governments will be less willing to completely junk something, which is the result of a process of consultation. I mean, that's all I can say.
Good evening. Thank you for a very enlightening talk and discussion. I'm Margaret Nakra, and I have just two very quick questions. One is you have mentioned the sustainable energy and renewable energy as the source of energy for the future. You have left out nuclear energy. Now, in Europe, there is a big controversy about it, as you know, I'm sure, like France goes ahead with it, saying it is clean, it doesn't give carbon emissions, and whereas Germany wishes to phase it out, is slowing it down because of the conditions at present. So what is India's stand on nuclear energy in this regard of coal? And the second is a similar question with regard to EVs. You are promoting 100% EVs, but there is a concern about that is two-way. One is how will you get all the metal that you need for lithium, which is, again, Ukraine-related problem, and other metals which are important, as well as how will you recycle, preferably, or dispose of batteries. Two questions, big questions.
Yeah, no, I'm glad. Thank you very much. On nuclear, I mean, I apologize for not mentioning it. Certainly, around the world, people are rethinking nuclear energy. We have consistently fallen short of the targets we've set for capacity in nuclear. We have the technology, but there are any number of resistances. People don't want a nuclear plant in their area, etc. But I think we need to make people more aware that nuclear energy is clean. But nuclear energy may not be actually cheaper, because the truth is that if you build in the cost of disposal, it may well be the case that nuclear energy is not cheaper. And I don't know enough about that. That's why I didn't mention it. The present situation is our rate of setting up nuclear plants is much below what we have targeted already. So it would be a good idea for us to achieve the targets that we have set. In the longer run, if fusion becomes a possibility, then of course there's a whole change in the ballgame. But that's a new area of technology that hasn't arrived yet. One of the biggest, if you like, gains that we have made ever since the Indo-US nuclear agreement, transfer of technology bringing in foreign technology in the nuclear area, providing it's suitably safeguarded, is not a problem. We've not done it. One or two cases we've done it. But one of the reasons we didn't do it is that globally the interest in nuclear energy sort of dropped sharply, particularly in Europe, but also in Japan. Both Japan and Europe are rethinking this. So my guess would be that since for the first time, we are now in a position that the earlier shackles that prevented us from bringing in nuclear technology from abroad are gone. So if we have a scope for bringing in some new technology which overcomes some of the problems that we are facing, pretty good. The difficult thing, though, isn't the technology. The difficult thing is getting approval, local approval for setting up a nuclear plant, because at the moment the public support for it is very minimal, and that's a real problem actually.
Thanks. Dr. Montek, I'm Vikram from Conservation India. Very heartening to hear that restoration and forests are part of the bigger solution. So, point on the forest department is like you said, right? I think one thing that we have always consistently seen that there is a colonial hangover that the forest department is the only keeper of our forests, and the definition of forest needs to be within certain protected areas, and any other public lands should not be under the definition of forest and should not be under the forest department. And that leads to significant challenges that I'm sure Sameer will attest to on afforestation efforts. We've had massive problems in restoration projects on anything other than existing forest lands or private lands. Other public lands don't get used. Related to that is the problem that now we have things like the FRA, the Forest Rights Act, where we want to give a modern lifestyle to twist to human rights for tribals, and somehow all of that again needs to come back from the same protected forest lands and not from the other public lands that we have, and not to be incentivize other agencies to kind of step into the biodiversity conservation and quality of forests, right? So from a policy perspective, there is a big disconnect between what needs to happen on the ground from a forestation and biodiversity perspective versus the way our governance is set up, right? So just wanted to get your thoughts on that. I'll just defer to the other question.
Hi, my name is Alok. I work at Google. I lead a couple of climate solution teams efforts. So my main question here is, what are key innovations that you think are going to be really useful for climate solutions in India? For key innovations, like, there's a lack of imagination. What innovations would really help with climate solutions broadly for India and Global South?
I wanted to ask if the notion of growth, does it account for the environment? And if not, is it time that we start talking about degrowth?
Yeah, no, let me do this in reverse. And I may forget some parts of the question. But, on the question of does the growth account for the environment, the answer is no. Because growth does damage two kinds of things. I mean, one is a lot of what is called growth is just pulling wealth out from the underground and putting it above ground. And, that's really not adding to output, but you're just selling off the family silver. But the other is when you do a lot of damage and you don't account for it. The short answer is yes, you should. And in fact, we had commissioned in the Planning Commission a report by one of the well-known Partha Das Gupta of the London School of Economics, that how would we create a national accounts that accounts for it? And the problem is that because these national accounts become used by everyone else as an indication of performance, unless every country does it, no country will adopt a national account which makes its growth less than what it is. But the short answer is yes, it is on the agenda, it should be on the agenda. And I think the best thing is that the UN should insist that all United Nations, all statistics should be accompanied by some measure of the damage that's being done. That would become quite complex. For example, in India, the excessive use of groundwater in the Punjab is actually lowering the potential productivity of agriculture in the future. Now, this is a politically explosive subject, so whether you can expect the statistical office to take care of the problem is difficult. Intellectually, I think you're absolutely right that we do need to take care of it. What was the other question, in case you remember now?
There was one around the forest department.
Yes. The trouble is, I know one or two people in the Forest Service, and they're fine people, actually. But I agree with you that the poor old Forest Department comes in for a lot of negative publicity. I think historically, they have not seen their task as a holistic task. Probably of all the civil service, the area where the colonial mentality prevails the most is the Forest Department. Partly also their whole approach to the tribal rights of tribals, etc. I mean, they view them as dominantly interfering in forests. And it has not been a very happy situation. I don't have a solution. But the short answer to the question that should all new afforestation in land that is not currently defined as a forest area, which is, of course, the preserve of the Forest Service, should that also be under the Forest Service? No, I don't see why we shouldn't have forests that are, if there is a desire on the part of the private sector to set up more afforestation projects, by all means, let them do so. And I agree that we should do that. I'm not sure that there is any legal bar to it. I think the legal bar is simply that it's all connected to where the land is.
Sorry, I didn't mean the private sector. That is happening already. Sorry. Yeah. Sure. Meant more of public lands which are not forest department.
Yeah, no, certainly if there are, I mean, there's no question if there are public lands that are not forest lands, the only question is, are you going to demarcate them as the responsibility of the Forest Service to a forest. Now, personally, the success of the Forest Service in maintaining the quality of the forests that they have is pretty poor. So I'm in favor of other public land being used for afforestation, but maybe you can find other ways of getting other agencies involved. That would help a lot, for sure. But that's a valid point. There was a third question, which I've now completely lost track of. Innovation. Now, the reason I lost track of that is the honest answer, I don't know. But clearly, the big areas connected with renewable energy, anything in the area of battery storage and technology related to battery storage would make a huge difference. Anything in the area of cooling technology, which would somehow make it possible to achieve cooling without too much use of energy, even renewable energy. I mean, remember, one of the things that in the new strategy we have to do is to get away from fossil fuel-based electricity, but not get away from electricity. So the fact is, we're talking about electricity, but making it green. But even green electricity costs something. So minimizing the use of that energy, the new green electricity, is a very valuable thing. So anything that improves energy efficiency of a whole range of home appliances would make a big difference. But that's not a unique thing in India, because this is going to be what every company everywhere in the world will be trying to do. So one other area would be what you might call low-income appliances that meet low-income needs. I mean, for example, a cooler that doesn't freeze. And you're not really talking about a cooler that actually kind of achieves freezing level temperatures and allows you to freeze food, etc. But a cooler that keeps fresh food fresh and edible for 2 days or 3 days, if you can do a low-cost way of doing it, that'd be terrific. I think Godrej and company did kind of experiment with some of these things, but I don't know that they have been all that, they haven't swept the market in a storm. But several other areas, particularly in things like vaccine transportation, in a manner that is cool, anything in the area of vaccines that reduces the need to keep it at very low temperature could make a big difference in terms of the ability to deliver these things. So there's lots of such innovation, but I'm not competent to list them. My guess would be that innovation in education would be a huge area. But of course, that's highly controversial, because there are a lot of people who believe that a lot of the stuff that is being done, electronic devices that serve to educate kids, are actually doing damage. So I'm, again, not competent. But in all these things, I think you do need to unleash innovation. And we're not the only ones tackling this problem. So I think one of the things we need to remember is who's doing what everywhere, and can we do something better? It's a highly competitive process. And let's say whatever Indonesia or Thailand or Malaysia are doing, we are half their per capita income. Maybe we can bring to bear skills that will enable us to find innovative ways of solving those problems.
Thanks. I think the biggest takeaway for me has been the fact that one of our keenest economic minds that led us through the growth years is now thinking of our ecology. And I think we need that mind shift and that narrative change to happen, really. Thank you so much.
Thank you.